The winter of 1943 was one of the coldest Italy had seen in years. The ground near the Anzio beachhead was frozen hard, and the air smelled of gunpowder and wet earth. Somewhere between two lines of soldiers, in a space that belonged to no one, a German medic named Klaus carefully made his way through the dark. He was crossing into no man's land, and he knew it was dangerous. But he had a job to do. Earlier that evening, his unit had taken a small group of American prisoners. One of them had been shot in the side. Another had pieces of metal lodged in his shoulder from an explosion. A third had a wound on his leg so deep that Klaus could see the bone when he examined it in the dim lamplight of the field tent. These were serious injuries. By any measure, these men should have been in tremendous pain. But they were not screaming. They were not crying. They were not asking for medicine. One of them was actually making a quiet joke to the soldier next to him. Another was looking at the ceiling of the tent with calm eyes, as if he were lying in bed at home and simply waiting for sleep to come. The third one, the one with the deepest wound, looked up at Klaus when he knelt down beside him and gave a small nod, as if to say, "I see you. Go ahead." Klaus had been a medic for 3 years. He had treated German soldiers, Italian soldiers, and a handful of others. He knew what pain looked like. He knew what it sounded like. He had held the hands of men who wept from lesser injuries than these. And yet here were these Americans, looking almost bored. He did his work quietly and professionally. But when he stepped outside the tent afterward, he stood in the cold air for a long moment and asked himself a question he could not answer: why were they not complaining? It was not an isolated incident. All across the European battlefields of World War II, German soldiers, medics, officers, and ordinary men in the trenches noticed the same thing about their American enemies. The Americans, when wounded, were strangely quiet. They kept moving when they should have stopped. They stayed in position when logic said they should have fallen. And in field hospitals and prisoner camps, when German medical staff would ask them how much pain they were feeling, the answer was often a shrug or a simple "not much." This was genuinely puzzling to the Germans. Not because they thought pain was a sign of weakness. In the German military, it was perfectly acceptable to express suffering. The Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces, had a culture that acknowledged the reality of injury. A wounded man was treated with compassion. He was expected to show that he was hurt, because showing it was honest. Hiding it seemed strange, even unnecessary. The American soldiers seemed to operate on an entirely different set of rules. And for a long time, no one in the German ranks could fully explain why. To understand what was happening, it helps to understand who the American soldier actually was in 1943 and 1944. He was usually a young man, often 20 years old or younger, who had been living a completely ordinary civilian life not long before. He had been going to school, working on a farm, fixing cars in a garage, or playing sports on weekends. He had never thought much about war. And then the world changed, and he found himself drafted, trained, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to fight in places he had barely heard of. His training was fast by the standards of experienced European armies. The German military had been preparing its soldiers for many years, building a culture of precision and iron discipline. The American system was more rushed, more practical, and, in the eyes of many German officers, less refined. German observers after the First World War had written that American soldiers lacked the snap and precision of European troops. They were seen as informal, almost casual, in the way they carried themselves. But informal does not mean weak. And casual does not mean careless. What those German observers had missed, and what their counterparts in the Second World War were now learning, was that the American soldier had a different kind of strength. It was not the strength of rigid obedience. It was the strength of a man who had decided for himself that he was going to get through this, and who did not feel the need to announce that decision to anyone. Inside an American rifle squad, there was an unspoken code. Not a written rule, not a command from an officer, but a social understanding that had developed naturally in the barracks and the training camps and the long, cold nights in the field. You did not complain about pain. You did not make a fuss about your injuries unless you absolutely had to. Not because showing pain was shameful, exactly, but because the men around you were going through the same thing, and adding your own noise to the situation helped no one. This was the culture of men who had grown up during the Great Depression, who had watched their fathers and mothers work through enormous difficulty without asking for much. They had learned from their earliest years that struggling quietly was simply what a person did. You carried your weight. You did your job. And if you were hurting, you dealt with it. The bond between American soldiers was also extremely strong, and it shaped behavior in surprising ways. A man fighting alongside his closest friends, men he had eaten with, joked with, and suffered alongside for months, was unlikely to become the one who slowed everyone down by making a loud display of his injury. The group mattered more than the individual moment of pain. And so, naturally, almost instinctively, wounded American soldiers pushed through. Not because they were ordered to. Because their friends were still fighting, and that was reason enough. There was another reason the Americans seemed to handle their injury so quietly, and this one comes from science. It was discovered not by a soldier, but by a doctor, a quiet, precise Harvard-trained physician named Henry Beecher, who served as a medical officer in the U.S. Army during the Italian campaign. Dr. Beecher worked in forward hospitals close to the fighting. Night after night, he received men with severe wounds, broken bones, deep cuts, internal injuries, and he noticed the same thing that the German medics had noticed, but from a different angle. He decided to study it carefully. He began asking the wounded soldiers directly, "Are you in pain? Do you want medicine for it?" The answer surprised him deeply. Of the more than 200 badly wounded men he studied, nearly 3 out of 4 said they were not in enough pain to want medicine. These were not minor scratches. These were men with serious, visible injuries. And they were telling him they were fine. Beecher was a scientist, so he did not accept "they are just tough" as an answer. He went looking for a real explanation. And what he found changed the way medicine understood pain forever. He realized that pain is not a simple signal, like a light turning on. Pain is an experience, and experiences are shaped by the mind as much as by the body. The same physical injury can feel very different depending on what a person believes it means. And for American soldiers on the Italian front, their wounds carried a meaning that quietly reduced the suffering attached to them. Think about it from the soldier's point of view. He had been living in mud and cold and constant danger for weeks or months. Every day, he did not know if he would be alive the next morning. The front line was a place of real and serious fear. And then he got wounded. He was taken out of the fighting. He was placed in a medical tent. People were looking after him. The immediate danger, the gunfire, the explosions, the patrols, was gone. His wound, in other words, meant safety. It meant he was, at least for now, not going to die today. It meant he might be sent home. Against that backdrop, the pain that came with the wound felt smaller. His brain was flooded not just with the signal of injury, but with the relief of survival. And relief, it turns out, is a powerful thing. It can quiet the body in ways that medicine sometimes cannot. When Beecher returned to the United States after the war and went back to treating civilian patients, he made a striking comparison. Civilians who came to the hospital with injuries similar to what he had seen on the battlefield consistently needed far more pain medicine. A civilian with a broken leg was in much more distress than a soldier with a broken leg. Not because the civilian was weaker, but because for the civilian, a broken leg meant something frightening: lost work, lost income, an uncertain recovery, fear of the hospital. The injury meant trouble. And so it hurt more. Beecher wrote about all of this in a landmark medical paper in 1946. His work introduced a simple but powerful idea: the meaning of a wound changes how much it hurts. And that idea, born in a field hospital in Italy while German soldiers scratched their heads in confusion, went on to reshape the entire field of pain medicine. There is one story from this period that sits at the center of all of this, and it involves a German officer who found himself face to face with exactly the puzzle his fellow soldiers had been struggling to solve. His name was Friedrich Lengfeld. He was 23 years old, a lieutenant in the German army, serving in the dense and brutal Hurtgen forest in November of 1944. He was already an experienced soldier. He had been wounded multiple times on the Eastern Front and had received several military honors. His own men described him as a leader who never said "go" when he could say "follow me." He was, by any account, a serious and thoughtful young man. On the 12th of November, his unit was engaged in combat against American forces in the forest. At some point in the fighting, an American soldier was wounded and fell in a minefield, a section of ground seeded with buried explosives that would detonate under the weight of a person. The soldier was calling out. He was clearly in pain and unable to move. Lengfeld heard the calls and ordered his men not to fire on any American medics who might try to rescue the soldier. He wanted to give the Americans a chance to get their men. But hours passed. The calls continued. No American medics came. Lengfeld could not stand it. The sound of a wounded man calling for help was something he understood completely. In his world, in his experience of war, a wounded soldier who called out was doing the normal, human thing. The right response, the moral response, was to help him. He made the decision himself. He gathered his own German medics and led them into the minefield to rescue the American soldier. They did not know whose mines they were walking into, or how many there were. They went anyway. Friedrich Lengfeld was killed by a mine during that rescue attempt. The American soldier's identity was never discovered. The story, which might have been lost entirely, was preserved by the soldiers who witnessed it and later by the American regiment that erected a memorial to Lengfeld, their former enemy, in recognition of what he had done. The story of Lengfeld is not simply one of individual bravery. It also reveals, quietly but clearly, what German soldiers expected from the wounded. They expected calling out. They expected distress. They expected a visible signal that a person needed help. That was the normal, human response to being severely wounded. And the American soldiers who lay quietly, who did not call out, who waved off medicine and looked calmly at the ceiling, they were the ones who did not fit the expected picture. They were the ones who left German medics standing in the cold, wondering. After the war ended in 1945, German military historians and analysts looked back at their experiences fighting the American army and tried to make sense of what they had seen. The records they left behind, including secretly recorded conversations between German prisoners of war in Allied captivity, which were later discovered in national archives in London and Washington, showed that this bafflement about American toughness came up again and again. In those private conversations, German soldiers did not speak of Americans with contempt. They spoke of them with a kind of reluctant respect. They described American soldiers as physically strong and individually brave, even if they lacked the tight, formal discipline of German military units. They described them as fighters who were difficult to predict and even more difficult to break. And they described, in various ways, this quality of quiet endurance that had no easy name. The German military culture had always prized its own toughness. German soldiers were trained to be hard, and they were. But their toughness had a structure to it. It came from discipline, from hierarchy, from a sense of duty to something larger than themselves. The American version of toughness looked different from the outside. It was looser. It was personal. It was the toughness of a man who had simply made up his mind, not the toughness of a man following an order. One German officer who had fought against American forces in both North Africa and Italy reportedly said, after the war, that the thing that most surprised him about Americans was not their equipment or their numbers, though both were impressive. It was their attitude. They seemed to believe, even in the worst situations, that things were going to work out. And that belief, that quiet, almost stubborn confidence, made them harder to break than anything else. Years later, when Dr. Beecher's research had spread through the medical community and been built upon by dozens of other scientists, it became clear that what those German soldiers had witnessed on the battlefield was a real and measurable phenomenon. Pain is shaped by psychology. The mind and the body are not two separate systems, they are one, and they talk to each other constantly. A person who is afraid experiences more pain. A person who feels safe, who feels hope, who believes the worst is over, experiences less pain, even with the same physical injury. The American soldiers at Anzio and in France and in the forests of Germany were not pretending to feel less pain. They genuinely felt less pain. Because their wounds carried a different message inside their minds than those same wounds would have carried in a different context. The wound was not the end. It was a way out. And the brain, receiving that message, turned down the volume on the suffering. This understanding now shapes the way medicine approaches pain management around the world. Doctors know that telling a patient what to expect, offering them hope, creating a sense of safety and control, all of these things actually reduce the physical experience of pain. Not just the emotional suffering around it. The pain itself. The signal in the body. It is one of the most important discoveries in the history of medicine. And it started with a group of young American men lying quietly on cots in a field hospital in Italy, declining morphine, looking calm, and confusing everyone around them. There is something worth sitting with in all of this. The German soldiers who noticed this quality in their American counterparts were not wrong about what they saw. The Americans really were different. But the difference was not in their muscles or their nerves or their capacity for suffering. It was in what the suffering meant to them. A man fighting a war he believes he will lose carries his wounds one way. A man fighting a war he believes he will win carries them another. A soldier who has been told since childhood that complaining is weakness carries his injuries differently from a soldier raised to express pain openly. And a young man whose wound represents a ticket away from the worst danger he has ever known in his life feels that wound differently from a man whose wound represents only more uncertainty and fear. None of these things make one group of people better than another. They simply make them different. And the difference, in this case, was visible enough that hardened German veterans, men who had seen enormous amounts of combat and knew very well what the human body looked like under pressure, could not quite explain what they were seeing. What they were seeing was not a performance. It was not an act of pride or stubbornness. It was something quieter and more genuine. It was young men from small towns and big cities all across America, frightened and far from home, carrying more than most people will ever carry, and doing it without making a sound. The war ended in the spring of 1945. The American soldiers who survived came home to their families and their towns and their old lives. Most of them did not talk much about what they had been through. They went back to work. They raised families. They went to baseball games and listened to the radio just like before. Dr. Beecher returned to Harvard and spent the rest of his career studying pain, the mind, and the mysterious space where the two meet. His papers were read by doctors all over the world, and his ideas influenced every generation of medical professionals that followed him. Today, when a doctor thinks carefully about how to help a patient feel less afraid before a difficult procedure, knowing that reducing fear will genuinely reduce pain, they are using something that Beecher first understood in a field hospital in Italy, by watching American soldiers refuse to complain. And somewhere, perhaps in an old letter or a diary or a conversation that was never written down, a German soldier who had served as a medic in that cold Italian winter told someone what he had seen. A man with a wound so deep it showed bone, lying quietly on a cot, looking up with calm eyes and giving a small nod. As if to say, "I see you. Go ahead. I am fine." He was not fine, of course. Not completely. But in the way that mattered most to him, in that moment, in that particular corner of that enormous and terrible war, he was. He was alive. He was out of the fighting. He was going to make it. And somehow, without anyone having planned it that way, that was enough to hold the pain at bay. End.